On May 10, 1996, Mount Everest was hit by the deadliest storm ever, trapping people in what's known as the death zone. For nearly 30 years, there's been debate about what really happened and who or what is to blame for the tragedy that killed 8 people that day. This story isn't just about a bad storm, it's about people pushing limits while facing impossible odds and having to make tough decisions while their bodies are shutting down from the high altitude. Heroes arose on that day, and so did villains. But the big question is, was anyone to blame? Or was it a tragic consequence of climbing the world's tallest mountain? We'll dive into the heart of the storm. We're going to hear from those who lived through it and get first-hand accounts from survivors, the heroes, and those whose decisions have been scrutinized for almost 3 decades. Buckle in, everybody. This is going to be a really long 2-parter series. And the reason why is because I've looked at all of the books and articles and interviews written by people who were involved in the tragedy. The main books I looked at were Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, The Climb and Above the Clouds by Anatoly Bukreev, Climbing High by Lena Gammelgard, Left for Dead by Beck Weathers, After the Wind by Lou Kashishki, and No Shortcuts to the Top by Ed Viesters. And if you're new to mountaineering and don't really know a lot about it, or Mount Everest, or the 1996 Mount Everest disaster, well, you're in the right spot, because I'll be explaining the most basic of terms as we go. Now, but one disclaimer, while looking at these sources, it's crucial to remember that they come from individuals who were experiencing that chaos firsthand. They were sleep deprived, they were dehydrated, they were barely eating, and transitioning from the exhilaration of summiting to the terror of descending and getting caught in the storm. Lena Gammelgard, who was on the mountain that day, sums up the personal accounts pretty well. She says that each book provides a unique perspective on the diverse personalities of the Everest climbers and the sequence of events that turn triumph into catastrophe. And every reader will naturally form their own opinion, and Lena accepts this as both a writer and a climber. It's difficult to maintain complete objectivity, particularly in these oxygen-deprived environments at extreme altitudes. So just keep all that in mind when you're listening to all these different accounts. So let's start right at the very basics. Where is Mount Everest? Well, it's situated on the border of Tibet and Nepal, nestled in the Himalayan mountain range. It's a staggering 8,849 meters, or 29,032 feet, and it's the highest point on Earth. Known as Chomolungma in Tibetan, which means Mother Goddess of the World, and Sagarmatha in Nepali translates to the head of the earth touching the heaven. And Mount Everest is climbed mostly from the south side in Nepal and the north side in Tibet. The most famous indigenous groups living in the Himalayas are the Sherpa people. And the word Sherpa is often used to mean mountain guide, but it's actually an ethnic group that mostly resides in regions spanning Tibet, Nepal, and India. And Sherpas have tons of mountaineering experience, and without them, many Everest climbs would be impossible. The Sherpa people are genetically adapted to high altitudes, which results in their reputation as really great mountaineers. They also have physiological traits that give them advantages such as better blood circulation than most people. British mountaineer Kenton Cool, who holds the non-Sherpa summit record at 17, acknowledges the indispensable role of Sherpas. He said when it comes to climbing the mountain, Sherpas have this phenomenal energy and power on the mountain, and they're the backbone of any expedition. Their contributions extend beyond guiding. Sherpas carry the heavy loads, they construct camps, they secure routes through treacherous terrain, and they ensure the safety of climbers. They also tend to all the climbers at camp and do the cooking. And then there's Sherpas who climb at higher altitudes, and they're very highly specialized. These jobs are obviously more dangerous, requiring experienced Sherpas, and they get higher pay. But of course, Everest is a dangerous game. There's avalanches, the altitude sickness, exposure, frostbite, ice blocks falling on you, crevasses to fall into. It just really never ends. And 1/3 of the people who have died on Everest were Sherpas. But a Sherpa has great incentive to go on these mountaineering trips because they can earn about 10 times the average wage in Nepal. Kami Rita Sherpa holds the record for the most ascents of Everest. In 2023, he climbed it for the 28th time at 53 years old. We're going to dive into the early expeditions here because they're really significant in the history of Everest, and they're very tied in to how commercial expeditions rolled out later on. The first British expedition was in 1921, and it was kind of a reconnaissance trip, mostly for mapping and to see if a route to the summit could be found from the north side. George Mallory, Guy Bullock, and Edward Wheeler spent 5 months of arduous climbing around the base of the mountain. They reached the North Col at 7,000 meters or 23,000 feet before being forced back by strong winds. And if you're wondering, a col is the lowest point of a ridge or saddle between two peaks. They didn't get to the summit, but it was then that they knew that it was possible. This was very exciting at the time. In 1922, the second British expedition headed out, and it also had Mallory on the trip again, and you'll hear about him a little bit later. They made several attempts on the north route, and they climbed to 8,170 meters or 26,800 feet before retreating. But it was significant. They were the first humans to climb above 8,000 meters or 26,246 feet. And we'll do a little sidebar here on 8,000 meter peaks. There's only 14 mountains on Earth that are over 8,000 meters. And any altitude over 8,000 meters is referred to as the death zone. Why is it called that? So the death zone is the altitude above a certain point where the pressure of oxygen is insufficient to sustain human life for an extended time period. Above 8,000 meters, the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere falls 40%, making it difficult for the body to get the oxygen that it needs. Some climbers have compared the experience to running on a treadmill and breathing through a straw. In the death zone and higher, no human body can acclimatize. The body uses up its store of oxygen faster than it can be replenished. An extended stay in the death zone without supplementary oxygen will result in the body deteriorating, loss of consciousness, and ultimately death. So that's why you see climbers strapping the oxygen tanks onto their backs as they're climbing Everest so they can breathe that supplemental oxygen. But a problem with that is they only have so much time on that oxygen, and if they take longer getting up to the summit and back down, they risk running out of oxygen if they're slow. And keep that in mind because being slow and delays are a really important part of this discussion later on. So back to the expeditions. A day after that first attempt, Australian mountaineer George Finch, described as one of the best alpinists of the time, attempted to climb Everest with his cousin, Geoffrey. Poor Geoffrey had zero mountaineering experience, but, he must have liked his cousin because he went along with him despite that. They climbed up to the North Ridge at 8,320 meters or 27,300 feet using oxygen for the first time. And this was significant because they were the first climbers to sleep using oxygen that high. But they didn't make it in the end. The third British expedition was in 1924 with Brigadier General Charles Bruce and George Mallory, with newcomers Noel Adell and Andrew Irvine. On June 2nd, they set off from the North Col to make the first summit attempt. But with extreme wind and cold, exhaustion, and the refusal of the Sherpas to carry gear farther, that led them to abandon their attempt. On June 8th, Mallory and Irvine left their high camp to attempt the summit. Odell was climbing below, and he saw the two on this ridge up ahead, way up above, nearing the base of the final pyramid. They were climbing what he thought was the very difficult second step. But it was the last time Mallory and Irvine were ever seen alive. And in 1999, Conrad Anker of the Mallory and Irvine Research Expedition found Mallory's body. And they still haven't found Irvine's body. And there's opposing views on this in the mountaineering community today as to whether the pair actually reached the summit or not. But as Ed Viesters said, it doesn't really matter if you make the summit, because if you don't make it down, it doesn't count.
Getting to the summit is optional. Getting down is mandatory. It has to be a round trip.
There's another attempt in 1934 by Maurice Wilson, a British eccentric. He had zero climbing experience, and his intention was to summit Everest by himself, which totally makes sense. And he wasn't a pilot, but he took a few flying lessons, so he flew himself there illegally from Britain. And like I said, Wilson wasn't a climber, so the tradition of going to Everest with barely any skills started way before the mountain was ever conquered, and continues to today. And he expected to make it to the summit with spiritual help. So that would make up for, I guess, the lack of climbing skills. But it's not believed that he ever summited. His body and his diary were found in a tent the next year. And there were many other attempts over the following years, but none of which were successful. And then in 1950, Nepal opened its borders to foreigners, and this was a new way into Everest. All previous expeditions started from Tibet. In 1951, a British expedition with Edmund Hillary traveled to Nepal to survey a new route via the south face. They concluded that an ascent was actually possible, and how exciting is that? So they spent the next month attempting to reach the western Coombe, which a Coombe is a bowl-shaped valley. But they were stopped short when a 90-meter or 300-foot wide crevasse stopped their progress. And a crevasse is a really deep crack that forms in a glacier or ice sheet. They can be hundreds of feet deep, and it can be really difficult to rescue somebody if they fall into one, because you can imagine falling into a block of ice, how fast the hypothermia would set in. So many people who fall into crevasses die of hypothermia. And then sometimes there's a sneaky little layer of snow that forms over a crevasse, creating this snow bridge. And those snow bridges blend in with the surrounding landscape, hiding the crevasse. So there's this giant crack hidden under this very thin layer of snow. And if somebody was to walk over it, you can imagine they would plummet into the crevasse. And that's why mountaineers secure themselves to each other with a rope. If one were to fall in, then the other one would also get dragged, but hopefully would have their ice axe to smash into the snow to stop the fall. That's the plan anyways. And then haul the person from the crevasse out. And did you think that was it for dangers on the mountain? Oh, have I got another thing for you. Then there's a little thing called seracs. Crevasses can create these seracs, which are these tall, giant blocks of ice that are formed where several crevasses once met. A serac is commonly house-sized or larger, and with little warning can topple. And icefalls have dozens of seracs. And icefalls are always moving, so those seracs are always falling. Yet another thing to make you not want to climb Mount Everest. In 1952, a Swiss expedition attempted to climb the south route, and after 5 days of effort, they found a way through the icefall and passed the crevasse that stopped the 1951 expedition. But the crevasse was still there, so this team first had to descend 18 meters or 60 feet down into it to a snow bridge, then use a precarious rope bridge that they built to get across the other side, and then climb up the other side of the crevasse. But they did it, and on May 27th, 4 climbers made it 8,400 meters or 27,500 feet. 2 of them turned back because they didn't have enough food for everybody, so Tenzing Norgay and Raymond Lambert kept going. But the weather stopped them, and they had to turn around just 250 meters or 800 feet shy of the summit. But those British weren't giving up. In 1953, the next year, the 9th British expedition returned to Nepal. And it was massive. It had 350 porters, 20 sherpas, tons of supplies for 10 climbers. The plan was for 2 summit attempts for each pair of climbers. The first pair went, and they made it to 8,750 meters or 28,700 feet, just below the summit. But they couldn't go any further. They were just 100 meters or 300 feet below the summit. They couldn't go any further because their oxygen equipment gave them problems and they ran out of time. 2 days later, the second attempt was made by the fittest and most determined climbing pair, 33-year-old beekeeper Edmund Hillary from New Zealand and 39-year-old Nepali lead Sherpa Tenzing Norgay. Using supplemental oxygen, they reached the summit at 11:30 a.m. They paused at the summit to take photos, which is hilarious because even back in the 50s, they took some selfies. And it was a historic moment, obviously. And Hillary said that after 2 minutes of taking photos without his oxygen on, that he was becoming rather clumsy-fingered and slow-moving. So they headed back down the mountain. Mount Everest had been conquered, and soon commercial expeditions would inundate the mountain, leading to hundreds of deaths and controversies about the commercialization of Everest. In 1992, the first commercial mountaineering expeditions began on Everest. And you might be wondering what the climbing world thought of this. Well, John Krakauer, who was on one of the 1996 teams, he said that early on they had contempt for all those who were climbing Everest because it lacked sufficient technical challenges, and many climbers at the time were actually in the same boat. They were all denigrating Everest and those who were climbing it. And to kind of exacerbate this, in 1985, a wealthy 55-year-old Texan with limited climbing experience got to the top, aided by a young climber named David Brashears, who you'll hear about a little bit later. That Texan went on to climb the 7 summits, the tallest mountain on each continent. So after this, lots of people started doing the 7 summits because they were like, if that Texan dude could do it who has no climbing experience, then so can the rest of us. So they flocked to the 7 summits and they flocked to Everest. In the spring of 1996, there were 30 expeditions on Everest, and at least 10 were commercial. John Krakauer was also a journalist for Outside Magazine and other publications at the time. He wrote essays and articles on mountain climbing, and those were collected in his first book called Eiger Dreams: Ventures Among Men and Mountains. That was published in 1990. And then he wrote Into the Wild, which is about Christopher McCandless. Many of you have probably heard of this story or seen the movie, about the young man who went to Alaska to follow his dreams. One day, Krakauer got a call from the editor of Outside Magazine proposing that he join a guided expedition to Everest in 1995. They wanted him to write about the increasing commercialization. The plan that year was for him to not climb, but just stay at base camp and report the story from there. And he considered it, but he bowed out at the last minute because he thought it would be really frustrating just sitting down at base camp for 2 months while everyone else is climbing. So he proposed something else, that he do it the next year in 1996, and he spend the next year training. It was kind of a long shot because the expense was massive for a magazine. The cost for one person to climb on an expedition was $65,000. Krakauer had been climbing for 33 years and had undertaken some difficult climbs in Alaska, Colorado, and South America. But he did these in his 20s and 30s, and now he was pushing 41 and past his climbing prime, according to him. And he'd never even been as high as Everest Base Camp. And he knew Scott Fisher, owner of Mountain Madness, who was a team going to Everest in 1996. For a while, it looked like Krakauer would be joining Scott's team, but at the last minute, Outside ended up working out a deal with Rob Hall of Adventure Consultants. He ended up charging a lot less than Scott did. And Scott and Rob would lead 2 of the largest commercial expeditions on Everest that year. And they both knew that embedding a journalist in their team could bring much needed attention to their businesses. Hall had one of the most successful guiding companies between 1990 and 1995. During that time, he got 39 climbers to the summit. He had more ascents than any other organization. 1996 would be Rob's 8th expedition. So let's look at the teams now, because these people are big players in the whole story. So you got to know most of them. Rob Hall was 35 years old and had summited Everest himself 5 times, more than any other non-Sherpa at the time. In 1992, he started a company called Adventure Consultants with his good friend Gary Ball, and it quickly became a premier expedition guiding company. But sadly, Ball died of a pulmonary edema in 1993 while climbing with Rob and another climber. And Rob was devastated, but he kept the company going. For the 1996 season, Rob would be the lead guide, and he hired guides Mike Groom, a 36-year-old Australian, and 31-year-old Andy Harris from New Zealand. Mike Groom actually became the 4th person to reach the 4 highest mountains in the world without bottled oxygen. But about 10 years earlier, Mike had lost all of his toes while climbing in the Himalayas. He froze his feet after being trapped out overnight in the open. Andy Harris had never attempted Everest, but had extensive climbing experience in New Zealand. And in 1985, he climbed a really difficult peak near Everest, which was at almost 7,000 meters or 23,000 feet. On the team, there were also 8 climbing Sherpas and many other Sherpas who were at base camp. As for the clients on the team, there was Frank Fishback, who was 53 and had attempted Everest 3 times, Stuart Hutchinson, who was 34 and a Canadian cardiologist, and he was the youngest client on the team, and he had previous 8,000 meter experience. John Taskey was 56 and the oldest climber on the team and had no 8,000 meter experience. Yasuko Namba was 47 and climbed 6 of the 7 summits. She spent 16 years chasing that goal and would be the oldest woman to summit Everest, the 2nd Japanese woman to do so, and the 1st Japanese woman to complete the 7 summits. And then there was Doug Hansen, who was 46. Doug previously attempted Everest with Hall in the 1995 team. Krakauer talked a little bit about his teammates and said that he really bonded with Doug. He lovingly described him as a wiry, hard-partying man with a prematurely weathered face that brought to mind an old football. What a great friend. Family described him as hardworking and charismatic and said that he had climbed many of the world's tallest mountains. Ed Viesters is a well-known mountaineer with a ton of experience climbing and guiding, and he was on that 1995 team as well, guiding for Rob Hall. That year, they got 5 clients to within 100 meters or 350 feet of the summit, but it would be too dangerous to push on, so they had to turn around. He said that Doug was so keen to go to Everest that he worked the night shift at a post office and worked construction by day. Doug was extremely likable, and Rob was just really disappointed that he hadn't been able to get him to the top. so he offered him a huge discount if he came back in 1996. Lou Kosciuszko was 53 and a lawyer. He'd been a climber for many years and had climbed mountains all around the world, including 6 of the 7 summits. He was also a marathon runner, endurance athlete, and had climbed in Antarctica at the same time as Rob, and had known him for quite a few years. Beck Weathers was 49 and had been climbing for 10 years and was also making a bid for the 7 summits. Everybody wanted to do the 7 summits, it seems. It was on all of their bucket lists. But Beck had no 8,000-meter experience at the time.
I was pursuing the 7 summits quest, which is to climb the tallest mountain on each of the 7 continents. I got that idea from Dick Bass, who's an irrepressible soul, and had basically pursued that and leaving Everest for number 7.
And he's super honest in his book. He says that he loved mountain climbing, the camaraderie, the adventure, the danger, and even the ego boost that it gave him. He actually fell into climbing as a response to a crushing bout of depression that began in his mid-30s. In the mountains, he could fix his mind. But he was also becoming increasingly self-absorbed. He had climbed 8 other major mountains around the world, and he'd worked like crazy to get there, hell-bent on testing himself against the ultimate challenge. And of course, there was John Krakauer, an accomplished technical climber, but he had no experience over 8,000 meters. Ang Dorje was Rob's climbing sirdar, or lead Sherpa. These Sherpas usually manage all the other Sherpas, and they typically speak English very well. Ang first worked with Rob in 1992, and by 1996 he'd climbed Everest 3 times. Rob said that Ang was crucial for their success. So why did all these folks choose to go with Rob's team? I mean, they were successful, that was for sure. But there's also a few other reasons, and Lou talked about them in his book. He said when he was looking for a team to join, professional leadership with proven experience above 8,000 meters was in short supply at the time. Up until 1996, he thought the risk of dying on Everest was just too great. So he was looking for somebody with a track record of good judgment and decision-making while in the death zone. He said everyone can make the easy decision, but not everyone can make the tough decision. I was looking for a leader who had a record of having the guts to make the hard call. And that's what Rob did in 1995 when he turned around that expedition. Guy Cotter and Ed Viesters were his assistant guides, and they all made that decision together to turn around at 12:30 p.m. Lou said they recognized that continuing climbing would make it too late for a safe descent. Rob had this predetermined turnaround time, and he stuck to it. The pressure was extreme, getting that close to the summit and saying no to these clients who had paid a ton of money, and there's no second chance and no refunds. But Lou also questioned himself. Would he have the courage and strength to turn around so close to the summit after 6 weeks of extreme physical and mental effort? But as for the guides that Rob hired, Lou was not happy. When he signed up for the team, Rob was supposed to be the expedition leader, and Guy Cotter and Ed Viesters from 1995 were supposed to be guides. This leadership trio was a huge part of Lou's decision to climb with the team. But he received a call from Rob a couple weeks before they left for Everest, telling him that the planned team wasn't going to work out. Ed and Guy had other commitments and they couldn't work for him that year. Instead, Mike Groom and Andy Harris would be taking their places. And Lou knew nothing about either of them. His concern about Andy grew after he met him because Andy said that he was a novice at high-altitude climbing. Almost everyone on the team had more high-altitude experience. But Lou avoided thinking about that. He trusted Rob, and he focused on Andy's strong climbing ability and the fact that he was a certified guide. Lou says that Mike was hired only 5 weeks earlier and was not a certified guide, and that he was reluctant to serve as leader but did it to help out his friend Rob. Lou was surprised that Mike had only occasionally worked as a guide and never on Everest. And then there was Krakauer. Lou just had a really bad feeling about him being on the team. First of all, none of them were aware that a journalist would be embedded in their team, writing about their every move. Lou said he was really upset to find out that a writer for a major magazine was going to be scribbling notes about them. And this is a time when they're doing the hardest and most dangerous thing that they'd ever done and potentially struggling for their lives. And he said, much worse than reporting facts, he was giving his own subjective judgment performance scorecard that heavily influences public perception. He was reporting back to outside in real time, which was another issue for the team. And no one consented to a journalist on the team. Everest was kind of a private challenge for everybody, and Lou felt really betrayed by Rob. And with that, there was now pressure on Rob to get this journalist to the top and as many climbers as he could because he was going to be written about. Rob could get a huge financial and promotional boost from the outside article. And Lou also felt that as climbers, they were all under greater pressure to push their personal boundaries of acceptable risk and physical limits. And on Everest, the stakes were incredibly high. And then we have the Mountain Madness team. That was Scott Fisher's team. And I've done a video before on Scott Fisher and his whole life, so check that out if you want. The link is in the description below. Scott was 40 at the time, and he guided clients all over the world. He'd had a ton of climbing experience. He'd been climbing since he was a teenager, and he was obsessed with it. He'd been to Everest 4 times. He got to the summit once, and this was his first time leading an expedition up the mountain. Scott started Mountain Madness in the 80s, but it never really gave him a good, steady income. And he knew that commercial success on Everest would draw clients from all over, and it would help the business tremendously. And the news that Scott was joining the Everest game was not good news to his competitors, especially Rob Hall, who was trying to break into the US market where Scott was from. In addition to Scott, we have Anatoly Bukreev, who was 38, and Neil Beidelman, who was 36. Anatoly was from Kazakhstan and considered one of the world's foremost high-altitude climbers. By spring of 1996, he'd climbed 7 of the most challenging climbs over 8,000 meters, some more than once, and climbed all without using supplemental oxygen. Neil was 36 and an aerospace engineer. He had no Everest experience, but plenty of climbing experience. Anatoly said Neil had extraordinary endurance because he was an ultra-marathon runner. And now the clients on the team. Martin Adams was 47 and had climbed Aconcagua, Denali, and Kilimanjaro, but had never been over 8,000 meters. He was excited that Anatoly was hired, and he felt that their chances of success were higher now that he was a guide on the team. Martin was actually on a team with Anatoly and Neil, climbing Makalu, the 5th highest mountain in the world, in 1994 and got to 7,400 meters. But most importantly, he trusted Anatoly's judgment and experience. Charlotte Fox was 38 and climbed all 53 of the 14,000-meter peaks in Colorado, and she summited 5 of the world's 8,000-meter peaks. Beck said that Charlotte Fox was one of his favorites. He'd climbed with her and Sandy Hill Pittman in Antarctica. Tim Madsen was 33 and Charlotte's boyfriend. He climbed extensively in Colorado and the Canadian Rockies with Charlotte, but he didn't have any 8,000-meter experience. Dale Cruz was 45 and a longtime friend of Scott's and had no 8,000-meter experience. According to many, he was the least strong on the team because of that lack of experience. And you may have heard of Sandy Hill Pittman. She was also on the team, and I have a video about her as well that you could check out. But we're going to get into more details about her in this video. She's a wee bit controversial. She was 41 at the time and climbed 6 of the 7 summits. And she was one of the climbers on the team with 8,000-meter experience. And she was kind of serving as a journalist on this team, sending daily updates to NBC. Since Scott couldn't get Krakauer, he felt that signing on Sandy was a bit of a prize because she also had more high-altitude experience and she was going to be sending dispatches to the media. If Scott got her to the top, that would be a huge deal, really good for business. But then there was the other side. If he didn't get her to the top, it could be a publicity fiasco. And then there was Pete Shunning, who was 68 and a legendary climber. He was well known for single-handedly saving the lives of 6 people during a mass fall on K2 in 1953. If he was able to summit Everest, he'd be the oldest person to do so. His nephew Clev was 38 and a former U.S. national downhill ski racer. He had no 8,000-meter experience, but had a pretty solid climbing resume. And then there was Lena Gamelgard, and she was 35. She'd climbed with Scott many other times, and he was the one who actually suggested that she come to Everest with him. She said her and Scott were similar in that they were like wild kids capable of behaving properly, but completely incapable of being controlled by anyone else. And inner discipline, she said, was not what Scott was best at. But she really grew to like Anatoly, even though he was a little bit misogynistic with her when she first met him. He asked her early on, "Why do you want to climb? You're a woman." That's my Russian accent. But then he followed that up with, "If you want to climb Everest, you must have the will to suffer." And he really grew on her. She really grew to love him. He was really caring, kind, and of course a very competent climber. So she felt the team was really strong and in great shape and high spirits when they first met. There were also 8 climbing Sherpas on the team, including Lopsang Jangbu, who was the lead climbing Sherpa and a friend of Scott's. As the lead climbing Sherpa, Lopsang was responsible for the high-altitude Sherpas. But Anatoly wasn't sure about him. Since Lopsang was only 23 years old, even though he had summited with Scott on his successful 1994 ascent of Everest, it wasn't really his experience, but Lopsang's youthfulness that made Anatoly nervous. Henry Todd, a Himalayan guide, said that the position of lead Sherpa takes a long time. You have to prove yourself over and over again, leading as well as climbing. His intuition about lopsang was that he was going to make all sorts of mistakes and he could well blow it big time. And then there's the IMAX team. Earlier I talked about Ed Viesters, who was supposed to be a guide on Rob's team, but it fell through. And this is why, because Ed was recruited by David Brashears, who is a filmmaker and climber. They were going to work on the first IMAX movie of Mount Everest. So speaking of Krakauer scribbling notes about people, when he was describing others on the mountain that year, he said that the credentials of many who came to climb the mountain in 1996 were as thin as mine or thinner. He said, in assessing their own abilities, half the population at base camp was clinically delusional. And Ed Viesters kind of reiterated that, and he said that a lot of people were up there who simply shouldn't have been. And they knew that none of them had any hope of summiting without considerable help from Sherpas and guides. But Krakauer did say that his team was far more competent than most of the climbers on the mountain, and he acknowledged that Scott's team was more experienced than Rob's team. And then there's the Taiwanese team. Krakauer said that they were ill-equipped and didn't seem to know what they were doing. He said they weren't familiar with the standard tools and techniques of glacier travel. They would climb across the ladders, which are really sketchy, and you'd usually cross one person at a time, but they would do it two at a time, making it more dangerous. And they kept snagging their crampons as they were walking and stumbling all over the place. It was like they didn't know how to walk with them. Makalu Gao Mingho was leading the 5-member Taiwanese team. The previous year, the team ran into trouble on Denali in Alaska. 9 climbers reached the summit, but 7 were caught in the storm on the descent and became disoriented. They spent the night out at 6,100 meters or 20,000 feet. Conrad Anker and Alex Lowe, 2 of the most skilled alpinists at the time, were also on Denali and stopped their climb to help the Taiwanese. And they were barely alive, the Taiwanese climbers. Conrad and Alex helped get them down the mountain, and 5 members had severe frostbite and 1 died. And as Makalu, the leader, was being hauled down the mountain by 2 guides, he yelled out to everyone, "Victory, victory, we made it to the summit!" As if this horrible disaster and death didn't just happen. So odd. Conrad said that it was a weird moment for sure. So when that same Taiwanese team showed up on Everest, everyone was wondering if they would run into the same issue as on Denali, where everyone else had to abandon their summit attempt to help. Rob said with so many incompetent climbers on the mountain that year, it was unlikely they'd get away without something bad happening. And he was right. So teams start out flying into Kathmandu, which lies at 1,371 meters or 4,500 feet above sea level, and it's east of the Himalayan mountains. It's the capital of Nepal and the most populous city in the country with around 845,000 people. It's one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world. So for summiting Everest, you can imagine that logistics are a massive piece of it and a critical piece of a successful climb. There's tons of food, equipment, supplies that have to be moved halfway around the world and across borders and 60 miles up the Khumbu Valley to base camp. Teams flew from Kathmandu about 100 miles to the village of Lukla, where they would begin a week-long trek into Everest base camp. And this trek to base camp is an important first step in preparing the body to acclimatize to the high altitude. They needed to go really slow as their bodies adjusted to the altitudes. If they didn't go slow, they would risk getting sick. Everest base camp alone is at 5,346 meters or 17,600 feet, which is higher than all but 2 points in the US. Beck described the hike in and said that every once in a while you come around a turn and there off in the distance is this giant rock, nearly 6 miles high, thrusting its head up above everything around it. And one of the dangers along with just hiking to base camp is people getting stomach bugs from the food and water along the way. It seems to be pretty common. And before even reaching base camp, Andy Harris suffered from multiple gastrointestinal attacks. He was advised to stop and rest for a night, but he proceeded to base camp with the rest of the team. And this is dangerous because it compromised his ability to acclimatize slowly to the altitude. At base camp, Sherpas would use picks and shovels to level the ice and rubble to set up a cook tent, a tent for equipment, and a communications tent. Base camp is basically a tent town of around 300 people on this glacier, which is always moving. Beck said that Rob's camp was the grandest of them all, and each climber had their own tent. Teams also had solar-powered satellite phones, faxes, stereos, and outdoor showers. And there's lots of boredom at base camp because most of the time they spend there is resting and recovering from climbing. But that didn't stop the parties from happening. Beck recalled one night where people were dancing on the table in the dining tent. But despite the ability to party, just being at base camp at that altitude was tiring for people. Beck talks about if somebody was transported from their home at sea level to the top of Everest, they'd be unconscious in the first few minutes and then dead shortly after that. The body can't withstand that enormous physiological shock of being placed in an oxygen-deprived environment. He said the moment you arrive at base camp, you're aware that every motion you make seems to suck the oxygen out of your body. And the climbers are actually kind of spoiled on Everest. Krakauer describes how every morning the Sherpas would bring them steaming mugs of tea while they were still in their sleeping bags in their tents. The Sherpas had to rise earlier than everybody else, collect water in a near glacial pond, heat it, and then make the morning wake-up rounds with tea to all the tents. Anatoly described base camp and said that in the mess tent there were always thermoses of Starbucks coffee, there were sports drinks, power bars, beef jerky, and the meals they ate were often really rich like pizzas and stews. One thing that was annoying to a few clients was the focus on the media and getting information out to the media. Lena talked about their communications tent, which was full of equipment, and Sandy would make daily reports and do interviews regularly. The doctor's clinic was also in this tent. And people give Sandy crap for all the extra gear she had, and there's no doubt she had a ton of extra equipment and even had it carried up to really high altitudes. But she actually also paid for extra Sherpas to carry all her gear, so her expense ended up being quite a bit more than the $65,000 price tag. People say that her equipment was unnecessary and extravagant, but when teams are bringing up Starbucks coffee and booze for parties, that argument kind of loses strength.
Hangout tents with an espresso machine and a pool table. Just like disco light. Wow. Anyone hungry? This is why I come back to Everest.
Especially at an age when, now today, streaming to the media, getting news out via the internet is commonplace, but back then it wasn't. So it was a little bit more odd to see, and so it probably stuck out to people. And at that time, communications equipment was becoming more common. Of the 14 teams at base camp, about half had satellite phones.
Hi, Sandy. Sandy's communication tent.
This time, Pittman came packing sophisticated satellite equipment provided by NBC. Her reports were filed over the internet as the teams went up the mountain. For the first time, climbing Everest had become a worldwide spectator sport, and Rob Hall and Scott Fisher had the most to gain.
And Lena, she had mixed emotions about the media circus, but she realized that she was also benefiting from the power of the press. If it wasn't for the Danish media, she wouldn't even be there. After a few days at base camp, things were not rosy for everyone. Lena talked about the health of their team, and at this point, Scott was in excellent form, better than she'd ever seen him. She said Anatoly was a monster, he was in great condition, and had been there a week ahead of everybody, so he was well acclimatized. Sandy was in great shape and high spirits, but had a crazy cough and had to take some medicine for it. Charlotte was an iron woman, just in top form, but she also had issues with coughing, and that was not uncommon. Both her and Sandy had to use inhalers at high altitude. And Martin was in great shape, but he also coughed like crazy at night. Lena said Neil was in great shape and very fast, but he also coughed up this green slime, but that seemed to be typical for him at high altitude. Anatoly is concerned with Neil's cough, though, because he was a guide and had to be 100%. Tim and Dale were both in good condition and slept well. Both had a bit of altitude sickness, but it wasn't too bad. And P was in good shape, but he had trouble sleeping and had to sleep with oxygen. Cleve was in super condition, and she described him as being tough and calm. Lena says she was in great form. She felt great and was doing well at high altitude. She had a slow start, but felt that she was on an upward curve. Anatoly had some concerns, though, and one was about the radios that Scott brought. They were these old radios, and radios are a critical item in an expedition. It's so guides can communicate with each other on the mountain, and they can communicate with base camp. It's a conduit for information for developing problems, emergencies, or weather. And Martin, he also said the radios were a joke, and when he asked Scott about them, Scott just said that that was all he had. But for Martin, it was a major misstep for Scott to take these old, crappy radios. As they spent more time at base camp, they got to know each other and hang out a little bit more, and Lou frequently sat with Doug at dinner. Doug was still hung up on his last Everest attempt, and he couldn't get it out of his mind. He told Lou that every day since the 1995 attempt, he thought about Everest. And as they talked one night, Lou learned from Doug that there were 11 expedition permits this season, and that struck him as being really high. In the previous decade, there were only 3 to 4 per year. Lou wondered if 11 permits would have an effect on their summit attempt and if he should be alarmed. Would it make climbing more dangerous? But he had no idea what the impact would be, so he asked Rob about it. Rob said he wasn't concerned, and Lou just accepted that. Krakauer talks about how Lou, Beck, and Stewart unpacked these brand new mountaineering boots that they barely wore. He wonders if they knew the risks of that because he'd done the same decades earlier and paid the price with debilitating foot injuries. But interestingly, Beck said that he never bought the idea that you needed to break in new mountaineering boots. Either they fit or they didn't, and he'd done that before. Unfortunately, his new boots rubbed both of his shins, which were soon ulcerated wounds. And any wounds at high altitude, they just don't heal, so he knew he wouldn't recover until he was off the mountain. So his strategy was to keep the boots pretty loose, but no matter what he did, each step was total agony. He had to wrap his shins in bandages and just suck it up and learn to live with the pain. Then Stewart realized that his crampons didn't fit his new boots, so Rob had to make a special strap for him. And on top of these issues, Krakauer said he was shocked to learn that most of the fellow climbers had rarely had the opportunity to go climbing more than once or twice in the previous year. He said although everyone is in superb physical shape, most of the training was on Stairmasters and treadmills rather than actual peaks. And Krakauer didn't feel that climbing could be replicated in a gym. The window for good climbing weather on Everest is short and occurs in the months of May and September. The top of Everest is engulfed by those jet streams that I talked about earlier for a major part of the year, so it's impossible to climb it. The earliest summit attempts ever in May had been on May 5th, 2009, and the latest was on May 18th, 2012. So you can see that window is very, very short. And there's actually about 18 to 20 different climbing routes on Everest. But 98% of all climbers choose either the north or south route. For almost everyone, the other routes are just too dangerous, difficult, and not commercially guided. On the south route, climbers start off on the Khumbu Icefall. And in all the things you read about the icefall, it's unanimously one of the most dangerous and feared sections of climbing Everest. It's 2,000 feet high, and crossing the icefall can take 3 to 5 hours for a fit climber who's properly acclimatized. But for somebody who's average conditioned with no acclimatization, it can take 12 hours. Camp 1 is around 6,000 meters or 19,685 feet, and it's at the end of the icefall. It's a vast area with endless snow, deep crevasses, and dangerous ice walls prone to avalanches. And what's weird is that climbers can also experience this extreme heat in this section because there's no natural protection from the sun and it bounces off the snowy walls, intensifying the heat. Camp 2 is at 6,400 meters or 21,000 feet. The climb to Camp 3 via the Lhotse Wall can be very challenging. It's basically just a sheet of ice with sporadic rockfall coming down from above. People traverse this section using fixed ropes. Camp 3 is at 7,200 meters or 23,625 feet. It's carved into the mountain and tents must be secured to the mountain wall for safety. To reach Camp 4, climbers must traverse 2 rocky sections which lead into that lovely place called the Death Zone. And then Camp 4 is fully in the Death Zone at 8,016 meters or 26,300 feet. And this camp rests on a plateau between Mount Everest and Lhotse, the 4th highest mountain in the world. After this, to get to the summit, climbers cross a sharp and steep ridge with the Hillary Step in the middle. And the Hillary Step is a steep rock face and the last major obstacle before summiting. Because there were so many teams, the expedition leaders had to have a meeting to figure out the day that each of them was going to summit. A large number of climbers in certain areas, such as the final part of the Hillary Step, could be a major safety problem. They decided to spread teams out to avoid the bottleneck or the lineup of people waiting to climb. Standing there still and not moving in the death zone at those extreme temperatures is really dangerous. And climbers have to get to the summit by that turnaround time that I talked about earlier. That allows them to have enough time to get back down before dark and to ensure they have enough oxygen to get back down. So any delays are really dangerous.
On May 4th, hoping to avoid a traffic jam up the mountain, expedition leaders met to coordinate their summit attempts. There is only a brief 2-week window in May when the ferocious weather is calm enough to give climbers a chance to make it to the top. David Brashears was there, and Scott Fisher, and Rob Hall, already working to make sure discipline would be maintained.
Maybe I'll get unpopular, but somebody has to be unpopular sometimes.
Rob's team was going to summit on May 10th, a day which he thought of as his lucky day. And they'd be going on the same day as Scott's team. According to Lou, this was unexpected, unlikely, illogical, and irrational. Alarm bells rang off in his head when he heard this, and he saw that the rest of his team was puzzled too. The whole point was for leaders to spread out on separate days to avoid the congestion, so why would Rob plan for the two largest expeditions to go to the summit on the same day? The number of people on those two teams was more than all the other teams combined, so it made no sense to Lou. And Rob made the decision without consulting anyone on the team, which annoyed Lou, but at the same time Rob, he was paid to make those hard decisions. But Lou said it was a major strategic departure from their expectations and climbing plan. He said in Rob's prior Everest expeditions, he never planned to go to the summit on the same day with another team, large or small. So this was not the time to do a practice round. And it was also a practice round with this untested leadership team. When the team questioned Rob about this, he downplayed their concerns, Lou said, with empty, aggressive rhetoric. And he said they were reading too much into it. He said they weren't combining teams or climbing together and that they'd probably never even be in the same place at the same time. He said, Everest is a big place, you know. And then the discussion ended. And in the end, Rob's words reassured Lou because he just simply trusted Rob. Lou later said for some reason it served Rob's interest, but he wasn't sure at the time why. Lou said, I'd only come later to understand the real reason. And if there had been no same-day decision, there would have been no 1996 tragedy. The IMAX team was also concerned about the mob on Everest. It posed a few problems for the film. Aesthetically, they didn't want footage of dozens of climbers straggling around in the background. And it also posed a safety dilemma to Ed, who reiterated that too many climbers in certain spots can create the bottleneck, which is a danger for everyone. Team leaders also talked about who would fix ropes. And by fixing rope, that just means that guides or sherpas go ahead and put ropes in really dangerous parts so clients can clip into them and not get blown off the mountain. So one team took on the ice fall, fixing ropes, and higher up, ropes fixed by various teams would be used by all the teams. The IMAX team agreed to get out one day ahead of everyone, and they aimed for a May 9th summit. The Sherpas would establish the camps above, and they'd shuttle the huge loads of gear, food, cooking stuff, tents from camp to camp. Meanwhile, the climbers would focus on acclimatizing to the altitude, and Beck describes how his team did this. Over several weeks, they would start at base camp, climb up past the ice fall, and then climb back down again. They would rest and then push up a little higher next time. Then come back down again, and rest, and do it again. They do this until the body begins to acclimatize, but it takes time. If you climb too fast, you risk that high-altitude pulmonary edema, in which your lungs fill with fluid and prevent you from obtaining sufficient oxygen. These symptoms can be quickly reversed if the person goes to lower altitude. But even deadlier is high-altitude cerebral edema, where accumulated fluid causes the brain to swell. It's a medical emergency and the person should get to lower altitude immediately. And some people are just more susceptible than others to both of these. Even veteran climbers can develop either without warning. Then there's hypoxia, which is much more common and caused by reduced supply of oxygen to the brain. It induces euphoria, it makes people a little goofy and confused, but severe hypoxia can rob you of your judgment and common sense, which is obviously very dangerous when you have to make critical decisions. And it can also quickly morph into high-altitude cerebral edema. So teams come up with acclimatization schedules, and Scott and Anatoly worked out theirs for their team. They would do 4 excursions up and down the mountain, and it would be mandatory for all the clients. So the guides and Scott could monitor them to make sure they're acclimatizing properly before the summit bid.
We are making history and we are setting protocol, so let's take care of our mountain.
One of Scott's employees at base camp noticed that he was physically tired by now. She said that he would get up in the morning and that it would take him about 5 minutes to finally stand up, and he was exhausted. He was taking Diamox every other day, which is commonly prescribed to help with acclimatization. The morning schedule for Scott's team looks something like this. Wake up with their little Sherpa tea at 4:30 in the morning, breakfast would be at 5, and then they would depart at 5:30. They'd climb as far as possible and then turn around at noon no matter where they were. When the sun gets high enough to warm the ice on the ice fall, Lena said, shit starts to happen up there. So they try and get back down before midday. So when teams started on their first acclimatization excursion, they headed up that terrifying ice fall, which starts right above base camp, where the Khumbu Glacier pushes itself out over a 2,000-foot precipice. A climber will spend about 20 hours total on the icefall with all the trips up and down. And you may have seen images of people precariously walking along on the aluminum ladders. Well, those are how they cross over those massive deep crevasses, and they had to walk over these bridges in their crampons, which are 2-inch long metal spikes at the bottom of their boots. So they had to place them very securely on the ladder rungs and go step by step. Those ladders are anchored to the shifting ice and lashed to one another. Beck realized that on all the round trips that they were doing, they would cross approximately 700 ladder bridges. And this was one thing that all the climbers seemed to agree on, that the icefall was scary. Krakauer describes it as terrifying and heart-pounding. The risks are always extreme because that glacier is moving on average of 2 to 3 feet each day. And this causes the deep crevasses to open and close and for seracs to collapse without warning. Lou said climbing the icefall is like a game of Russian roulette. He said, as a climber, you have no control over the blocks of ice, but you know that each and every one you pass over or under will one day collapse. Martin said when they got to some of the ladders, some people would walk across normally, some would crawl, and others would scooch across on their butts. And he said that Lena and Sandy were actually the best across the ladders because they were very well balanced and they weren't really intimidated by the crevasses below them. Charlotte found that scooching across on her butt worked best. And Lena described one horrifying part of the icefall called the mouse trap. And you can only imagine what that is. It was this massive leaning tower of ice which loomed above the climbers at this frightening angle. The only way to pass it was up and over, and this serac was going to fall, but the only question was when. Hopefully when you're not under it or on it. Everyone on Scott's team made it through in the time required. Rob's team climbed up to Camp 1 but stayed for less than an hour before heading back down. Krakauer, always watching his teammates, assessed his fellow clients' climbing skills on this day, which I'm sure they just loved. He said that Beck and especially Yasuko looked the weakest and appeared to be in danger of falling off the ladders and plummeting into a crevasse. He also said that Yasuko didn't know how to use crampons, which I really question considering her climbing history. She did the 7 summits, and although they aren't all like Mount Everest, some are actually technically quite easy, but of the 7 summits, 5 of them require the use of crampons. Krakauer was impressed with Scott's team, though. He said that they went by at an impressive clip. Lena recalls getting to the top of the icefall after 5 hours, and she was absolutely elated because she thought it would take her about 8 or 9 hours. And as she stepped onto the western comb and spun around to see Everest, Lhotse, and Nuptse, 3 massive cliffs, each one incredible on their own, and together they were just overwhelming. Anatoly was pleased with the performance of his team, but surprised by the number of clients who didn't have the self-reliance to move through the icefall on their own, without being constantly monitored by a guide. He wondered what would happen when no one was there to hold their hands. And tensions were mounting as Sandy and Lena started to butt heads, and both of them were driving Neil crazy. Then Neil got stuck with helping Sandy with her technical equipment, which he didn't really have to do, but he was helping her out. Emotions were ramping up as teams got higher and more tired on the mountain. Lena noticed that now Scott, Neil, Sandy, and Martin were all feeling sick and taking altitude medicine. On their second trip up, this time they're going to spend 2 nights at Camp 1 and then continue to Camp 2 for 3 additional nights before heading back down. Krakauer was getting dizzy from that heat. The sun was on the glacier and it felt like a huge solar oven. And that's when he came across what he thought was something wrapped in blue plastic sheeting. It took his impaired brain a few minutes to realize that it was a body, the first body they had seen. He was shocked and disturbed and just kind of stared at it for a few minutes. And then there was more bodies up the mountain. Up to that point, over 600 people had attempted Everest, with about 130 dying on the mountain. Those who die are brought down only if they're below a certain altitude and if the transporting of them doesn't really pose a huge risk to the rescuers. If a climber dies high up on the mountain, recovering the body requires almost an expedition and is a risk to more injuries and casualties, so it's not done very often. And the Sherpas believe that it brings misfortune if you remove the dead from the mountain. On the third trip up to Camp 3, Anatoly noticed the climbers didn't really have the enthusiasm they had the day before. The increase in altitude was having an impact on everyone. Pete was behind the team, and he was much slower, so Scott was climbing with him. Meanwhile, Scott was still looking really tired. Anatoly thought that he was worn out from all the logistical things that he was doing and didn't have much rest after his last acclimatization excursion. And this is when Scott took Anatoly aside and told him that he wasn't doing a great job, which Anatoly was shocked to hear. He thought he was working really hard. He had been working and climbing nonstop and setting up tents. Scott told him that he wasn't very attentive to the clients and didn't help them set up their tents. But at the time, Anatoly was helping the sherpas set up the tents, so he felt the clients didn't really need help and actually thought that them working hard would help their acclimatization. But Scott didn't agree. Anatoly started to feel that there was this misunderstanding as to why he was hired. Neil told him that clients wanted their hands held since many haven't been over 8,000 meters, and Anatoly just thought that was absurd. He was not the kind to hold hands of anyone. He really thought that people should be self-sufficient, and many people do say that you need to be totally independent on Everest, and you need to be able to save yourself and not rely on anyone else. Veteran climbers will tell you that. Anatoly felt that they needed to encourage the self-reliance with the clients, but Neil disagreed and told him that he didn't think that even half the clients would even summit. Lena thought that Scott was accusing him of not socializing with people and that that's what he was hired to do instead of working hard high on the mountain, which Anatoly thought was his job. And on top of that, Anatoly had Krakauer going in on him about his clothing. Krakauer said that Anatoly was underdressed and pointed out to others that he was wearing running shoes while climbing, and kind of mocked him for it in the book. But for Anatoly, this was totally normal practice for him. They were not ordinary runners. They were these shot-putting shoes with spikes on the bottom that were given to him by a friend on the Russian Olympic team. They were light, and that's exactly what he wanted, so he could fly up the mountain quickly. And he'd been using these for years. All of his equipment was reduced to a minimum. Plus, the guy was one of the best climbers around, so ridiculing his footwear or clothing just seems so ridiculous. And Anatoly heard that other climbers started making fun of him for this, which he just thought was petty and dumb. Martin was growing increasingly dismayed at the way the expedition was being managed. He said logging onto the internet seems to be more of a priority than logistics. He was upset at this time that Camp 3 hadn't been established, and not being able to go there would break his acclimatization routine. And Camp 3 wasn't in place because Scott's team was shorthanded and the winds were fierce, turning back people who were trying to set up the tents. According to Anatoly's book, clients were growing increasingly frustrated with all the delays. One client anonymously said that Scott, Neil, and Anatoly didn't seem to be paying attention to details, and that Neil and Scott would go zipping by each other like they were racing. The weather stabilized on April 25th, and Anatoly went to fix the ropes between Camps 3 and 4 with Ang Dorje of Rob's team. People were really getting on each other's nerves now. Who knows if it was the exhaustion, being with each other for so long, weeks after weeks in close quarters. But Lena admitted that she really didn't like Neil. She said that he needed to be worshipped as a guide, and she wasn't going to do that. He would tell her the most basic things about climbing that she already knew. She was really angry at him and at one point just totally lost it on him and told him to stay away or she'd kill him. So tensions were obviously ramping up. She said, "I think he had a hard time with me." At that point, Dale wasn't doing well, so they sent him down the mountain. And Scott ended up going all the way down to base camp with him, which was not planned. This was kind of an extra trip down, all the way down to base camp for him. And this was a huge concern to Anatoly because Scott's acclimatization routine and schedule had been broken repeatedly. They finally made it to Camp 3 and spent the night there. The next trip up would be the actual summit bid. One more trip up and down the mountain. Krakauer shared a tent with Doug, and when they got up in the morning, Doug said that he just felt like shit. He thought something was terribly wrong with his throat and said that he was getting too old for this stuff. He didn't think he could continue. By the time they got back down to Camp 2, Doug had serious frostbite on several toes. The year before, he had frostbitten his feet so badly that he lost some tissue from his big toe, which permanently impaired circulation. But even worse was the injury to Doug's respiratory tract. Less than 2 weeks before leaving for Nepal, he had minor throat surgery, leaving his trachea in extremely sensitive condition. That morning, Krakauer said Doug froze his throat. And then Doug just said the climb's over for him. He didn't think he could summit and he was done. But Rob came in and told him not to write himself off just yet, to wait and see how he felt after a couple days of rest. He said, "I think you still have a good shot at the top once you recover." But Rob could not have been more wrong. Pete and Dale were struggling, Yasuko and Beck were not as strong as they should have been. There was tension among the guides and Scott was exhausted. On top of that, Lobsang, his number one Sherpa, was coughing and vomiting really badly as he tried to acclimatize. Things were really starting to fall apart for a lot of people. Lou was concerned about the unproven guides on the team and wondered if they would step up and make the hard decisions if they needed to while in the death zone. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Rob and Scott, the Taiwanese team also chose to summit on the same day. That meant on May 10th there would be over 40 climbers heading for the summit, and 5 of those people would never get off the mountain.